You are about to hear a story that destroyed a plantation, erased 13 men from polite society, and left behind nothing but a ledger, scorched into ash. A ledger that had taken lives long before the fire ever touched it. Picture April of 1841, South Carolina's Low Country. A wealthy plantation owner, Silas Rutledge, stands inside his study beneath the trembling glow of a candle. And in a moment that would haunt the county for generations, he signs a document giving complete authority over his adult daughter, not to a doctor, not to a husband, but to one of his enslaved men. He calls it medicine. The county calls it scandal. History tries to forget it, but some stories refuse to stay buried. This chapter is where everything begins, where power, secrecy, and vengeance collide inside a house called Cypress Grove, a place built on 800 acres of cultivated wealth and quiet cruelty. The live oaks drape their moss like mourning cloth. The river moves slow, swallowing secrets, and the walls of this plantation have been watching for decades. Silas Rutledge cared about one thing above all else: reputation. To him, people, enslaved or free, even his own family, were objects that existed to hold up his status. He traded human beings the same way other men traded furniture. He smiled in church, shook hands at the courthouse, and signed orders in the dark that carved families apart. And beneath that polished surface, Silas belonged to a secret brotherhood known only in whispers as the Brethren of the Harvest. 13 men who hid their appetites behind wealth, robes, and ritual. Men who believed sacrifices fed their fortunes. Men who kept a ledger where every cruelty was written like an inventory list. His daughter Catherine was the place where his public performance and private rot met. At 12 years old, she had seen something she was never meant to see: a ritual in the Brethren's hidden chamber beneath the house. A sight so horrifying that the adults around her labeled it hysteria, just to avoid confronting the truth. They drugged her into silence, locked her in rooms, dismissed her as insane. But memory is stubborn, and Catherine remembered everything. Years later, she became dangerous, not because she was mad, but because she was finally waking up. Now enter Ezekiel Cross. Sold away from his wife Sarah and 2 children, Benjamin and Ruth, all of whom died soon after the separation. His grief had not softened, it had sharpened. He had tracked the men responsible for years, working plantation to plantation, drawing closer to the heart of the network that had destroyed his family. Cypress Grove was not an accident. Ezekiel placed himself there. Quiet, strong, skilled with herbs, patient enough to swallow rage until the moment it was useful. And when Silas handed Catherine over to him, public humiliation, disguised as medicine, it granted Ezekiel something no enslaved men at Cypress Grove had ever been allowed before: access. Access to the study, access to the cellar, access to the locked drawers where the brethren kept their secrets. The people in that house did not know it, but the moment Ezekiel crossed the threshold, the foundations of Cypress Grove began to crack. Inside Catherine's medicine-soaked haze, Ezekiel began cleansing her, brutally, carefully, detoxing her from the opiates that had kept her memories buried. She vomited, raged, trembled, and returned piece by piece to herself. And when she regained clarity, she told him everything. The hidden chamber, the rituals, the ledger. A book that recorded names, dates, sacrifices, and transactions, cold and clinical, written by judges, ministers, and men the county trusted. He listened. Catherine remembered. and their anger linked like chain. Together, they planned to find the ledger. They waited until Silas left for Charleston. They memorized the kitchen roots and the creak of every old board. They slipped into the cellar and found the false panel Catherine remembered from childhood. Behind it, the chamber waited, only lit by Ezekiel's trembling candle. And there, on a stand like a throne, sat the ledger. Heavy, leather-bound, metal-clasped, decades of crimes written in small, precise handwriting. Ezekiel turned to the pages of 1838. There, 3 lines, was his family. Family unit purchased, separated, sent to Alabama, payment received. No remorse, no humanity, just a transaction. That moment forged Ezekiel into something unstoppable. They copied entries for hours. Catherine translated her coded childhood notes. They mapped names, dates, participants. It was not passion, it was research for justice. Then footsteps, light, Silas, smiling, as if he had been waiting for applause. He locked them in the study. He summoned the brethren. He turned the night into a private trial. And he offered Ezekiel a bargain. Join us, serve us, become one of us. Catherine would be exiled with a new identity. Ezekiel would be initiated. The ledger, Silas promised, would remain hidden forever. Ezekiel pretended to accept. But inside, the second he heard the word initiation, he began designing something else, a third path, a final path. Not submission, not escape, revenge. This is where chapter 1 ends, on the night Ezekiel is taken into the cellar for the initiation, bound before the brethren. A knife placed in his hand, a trembling enslaved woman forced forward as his test. He lifts the blade. The robed men lean in. They expect obedience, but Ezekiel's cross was never theirs. And when the knife strikes, the fire that will erase 13 men from polite society has already been lit. The brethren believed themselves untouchable. Men who ruled courts, ran churches, controlled money. Men who had never lifted anything heavier than their own hubris. So on the night of Ezekiel's initiation, the night meant to break him, they set the stage. Ritual room, candles, robes. A terrified young enslaved woman forced forward as the test. The knife placed in Ezekiel's hand. The expectation was simple. Kill her, and he lived. Refuse, and he died. But Ezekiel had already chosen a different script. The blade moved, but not toward the girl. He drove it into the throat of the closest robed man. Chaos exploded. Candles toppled, robes ignited. The circle of powerful men discovered their soft hands were useless. Ezekiel fought like a man who had buried too much loss to fear death. He cut the woman's bonds, shouted for her to run, and tore through the circle like justice given form. Above them, a different revolt was blooming. Catherine had never been sent north. She was in the slave quarters, spreading the truth, showing copied ledger scraps, awakening the fury of people who had been used, broken, sold. 23 enslaved men and women armed themselves. Axes, sickles, hammers, anything that could make history obey them for one night. When the freed woman burst into the quarters, screaming that Ezekiel was fighting alone, Catherine gave the only command that made sense. "We finish this together." They stormed the cellar, with the force of a dam breaking. Judge Pelham reached for a pistol. He never fired it. Reverend Crenshaw begged to pray. No one listened. The brethren fell one by one, not because revenge was intoxicating, but because justice had been denied for too long. At the center stood Silas, grabbing Catherine and pressing a blade to her throat. For a breath, history held still. Then Catherine proved she was not the silenced girl he had raised. She struck him. He fell. Ezekiel stepped forward. "You took everything from me, and there will be no mercy." The cellar went quiet. 13 men lay dead. The ledger sat on its stand, and the survivors faced a choice: expose the truth and die hunted, or burn the record and protect the living. They chose survival. Catherine tore out the pages containing Ezekiel's family's names. He folded them carefully, their last remains. Then they burned the ledger until it curled into ash and smoke. To cover their rebellion, they set the cellar ablaze. Candles overturned, fire spreading like judgment. The house collapsed in a roar. By dawn, the official story was ready. A tragic fire. 13 respected men lost. The owner and his daughter dead. A county in mourning. No one looked deeper. No one asked the right questions. And the survivors scattered, some sold, some vanished, carrying a truth that would never make it into the county's books. Cypress Grove had always made sounds. Doors swelling in the humidity, shutters rattling, the deep groan of old beams carrying the weight of generations. But on the night after Ezekiel's killing, after he walked out of the chamber dripping with a sanity the brethren mistook for loyalty, the house became unnaturally still. It didn't breathe. It waited. Catherine was already awake when she heard the latch. She sat up, fingers trembling around the quilt, expecting to see her father or, worse, one of the robed men coming to prepare her for her new, corrected life. But it was Ezekiel. His shirt was torn, his hands were shaking, his eyes, usually steady as iron, were burning with something she had never seen in him before. Not fear, not anger, but timing, precision, a mind clicking into place. "Is it done?" she whispered. He nodded once. They believed everything. Catherine exhaled, but it wasn't relief. It was dread, the kind of dread that comes when you know the next step is the step that can't be undone. Ezekiel knelt beside the bed. "We have one night. After tomorrow, they begin the rites. Once that happens, not even death will free anyone here." She didn't ask him what he meant. She didn't want details. The brethren's rituals were designed to break the mind long before they touched the body. "What do we do?" she asked. Ezekiel reached into the small cloth pouch tied under his sleeve. Inside were things she recognized: feverfew, nightshade, foxglove, a vial of dark liquid that smelled like crushed almonds. "This is the only way," he said. Poison. Not for killing, for incapacitating, for turning the brethren's bodies into dead weight while their minds remained awake, forced to watch the destruction of everything they had built. The plan was madness. It was also perfect. But Catherine shook her head. "They'll notice. My father checks everything." "He checks what he fears, not what he trusts." And he explained. The brethren drank wine before every ritual. Wine Silas believed was blessed, wine he never tested, wine poured only by the enslaved staff. Ezekiel had already arranged a shift change for the next evening. One of the men on the pouring rotation owed him a favor. All he needed was the mixture. Catherine listened, palms sweating, heart pounding, and then she made the decision that shifted the weight of history. I'll prepare it. Not because she wanted revenge, not because she wanted justice, but because she finally understood what her father truly was. She had spent years believing she was broken, mad, hysterical, fragile, when all along the madness had belonged to the house, the rituals, the men who claimed righteousness while burying sins beneath red wax and signatures. This was not disobedience. This was self-defense. Ezekiel set the herbs out on the small table between them. Catherine crushed them, ground them, and mixed them into the wine additive, a thick, syrupy liquid that disguised bitterness. The smell was faint, almond and damp wood, nothing more. When she was done, her hands were stained deep green. Ezekiel's were steady as he poured the mixture into the vial. Then came the most dangerous part of the plan, the ledger. It could not be stolen. Silas would notice. But a copy, a perfect copy, could be. Catherine retrieved the stack of parchment she had hidden beneath a loose floorboard. Ezekiel lit a single candle, shielding it with his hand so the light wouldn't spill under the doorway. For hours they worked. Ezekiel copied entries. Catherine translated symbols and dates. Each line they wrote felt like prying a nail from the coffin the brethren had built around the county. The names were there: judges, merchants, priests, transactions, punishments, purchases, rituals disguised as baptisms, corrections, or treatments. Whole families vanished into those pages, many of them because Silas had been paid to silence them. And as Catherine wrote her father's name over and over, something in her cracked, but not with pain, with clarity. Silas was not losing her daughter. He had never had her. By the time the candle burned low, the copy was complete. Ezekiel rolled it tight, wrapped it in oilcloth, and pressed it into Catherine's hands. "If I fall," he said quietly, "you run. You take this north. You find Dawson's Ferry, ask for the freedmen's preacher named Jonah. He'll know what to do." Catherine swallowed hard. "And I fall?" "You won't." There was no comfort in his voice, only certainty. Then, as dawn crawled pale and thin across the sky, the house finally exhaled. The walls creaked again. The shutters rattled. The old groan returned. Because Cypress Grove did not know it yet, but this was its last sunrise. And inside that dying house, Ezekiel and Catherine sat back to back on the floor, planning the order in which they would dismantle everything that had destroyed them: the poison, the ritual, the chamber, the fire. By nightfall, the brethren would sit together in their sacred fall, lifting their blessed wine in arrogance. They would drink, they would choke, they would fall, and the house would stop breathing for the very last time. Evening settled on Cypress Grove like a warning. The air grew heavy, the sky bruised purple, and the marsh behind the property buzzed with insects, as if the land itself sensed what was coming. Inside the main house, preparations for the Brethren's gathering moved with ritualistic precision. Every man on the plantation had the same instructions they always did. Keep your head down. Don't look the robed figures in the eyes. Don't breathe too loudly when they pass. Catherine stood at the top of the staircase, looking down at the men assembling below. All 13 of them, including her father. Silas Rutledge wore his ceremonial robe with a pride that made her stomach twist. His face was calm, composed, even joyful, as if tonight was a celebration rather than a night carved out for terror. Ezekiel stepped out from the hallway behind her, but only briefly, just long enough to whisper, "It's time," before disappearing again into the servants' passageway. His role was crucial, and he had to move unseen. Catherine's heart hammered, but her hands were steady. She descended the stairs. Every robed head turned slightly toward her, but none of the men dared speak. She had been introduced to them in childhood as a fragile mind, a broken creature, no threat whatsoever. Her father had smothered her truth beneath tinctures and shame. Silas stepped forward, lips curved in a rehearsed smile. "Daughter," he said, gently brushing a stray curl behind her ear, "your presence honors the brethren tonight." She forced herself not to recoil. Her father's touch felt colder than the stone floor. "I only wish to observe," she said softly. He nodded, satisfied, because to him she was a decorative object, a docile shadow. Perfect. As the men moved toward the chamber entrance, the enslaved staff approached with trays of crimson wine goblets. Ezekiel wasn't there, he couldn't be seen, but the mixture he and Catherine prepared was. Old Thomas, the elderly servant who had taken over the pouring rotation for the night, passed the goblets out one by one. He kept his eyes low, but when he reached Catherine, he hesitated for the briefest second. It was subtle, barely a pause, but Ezekiel had clearly told him something. Catherine did not reach for a cup. Her father didn't offer one. Good. Exactly as planned. Silas raised his goblet, signaling for the others to follow. "Brothers," he said, voice echoing through the corridor, "tonight we celebrate power, legacy, the preservation of order. May our oaths remain unbroken." Cups lifted, red wine shimmered, and 13 men drank. Slowly, deeply, without suspicion. Catherine held her breath. Nothing happened at first. A minute passed. Another. The men laughed softly amongst themselves, adjusting their robes, preparing for their descent into the chamber. Silas placed a hand on Catherine's shoulder, guiding her to follow. But then, a flicker. Judge Harwood wiped his mouth, frowning. His hand trembled. Across the hall, Merchant Ellis blinked rapidly, swaying on his feet. Another minute. 2. Then one of the men dropped his goblet. It shattered. He went down with it. Silas turned sharply, confusion flashing across his face. "What is this?" he snapped. His voice echoed, but it wasn't answered by words, only by the thud of another man collapsing. Then another. The brethren clutched their throats, their limbs stiffening. The poison didn't stop their hearts. Ezekiel had measured it perfectly. It only stole their strength, their ability to move, their control, their power. Catherine watched as the men who ruled over so many lives fell helpless to the floor, like marionettes cut from their strings. Only Silas remained upright. Barely. He staggered, gripping the doorframe, breath ragged. His eyes locked on Catherine. What did you—" He couldn't finish. She stepped back, keeping distance. Her hands did not shake. "It wasn't meant to kill you," she said quietly. "Just to make you finally listen." Silas tried to lunge toward her, but his legs buckled. He dropped to his knees, choking, with rage more than pain. "You ungrateful!" She cut him off with a whisper. "No, just awake." The entire scene lasted less than 3 minutes. 13 men lay helpless across the chamber entrance, groaning, unable to lift their arms or pull themselves upright. The poison locked their muscles, but left their minds painfully clear. And that was the point. Catherine turned away from them, because someone else was coming. Footsteps echoed from the servants' passage, measured, deliberate, steady. Ezekiel emerged from the shadows with the calm of a man walking into a truth he had waited his whole life to face. Catherine's voice did not break when she said, "They're ready." Ezekiel nodded once. A single nod, the kind given before a storm breaks open the sky. And as he stepped past the fallen brethren toward the chamber, toward the heart of the secrets they had guarded for decades, the house seemed to tremble, like old wood recognizing judgment. Silas tried to speak, tried to curse, but all that came out was a strangled hiss. Ezekiel didn't look at him. Not yet. There would be a moment for that. But first, the chamber had to be sealed. The ledger had to be exposed. And Cypress Grove had to burn. Tonight, the powerful would meet the consequences of every name written in that book. Ezekiel stepped over the bodies of the brethren without pause. None of them could move. All of them could see. That was the justice. Judge Harwood clawed weakly at the floorboards, fingernails scraping wood. Reverend Malloy's breathing came in short, panicked bursts. Merchant Ellis lay on his side, staring at the ceiling as if praying for a miracle that would never come. And Silas Ruddled, dragged his failing body an inch at a time toward Ezekiel, hate burning in his eyes even as his limbs betrayed him. You dare! After I elevated you! After I spared your—" Ezekiel stopped. He looked down at Silas with an expression that wasn't hatred. It was clarity sharpened by grief. "You ended my family," Ezekiel said calmly. "Tonight, I end the silence that kept you safe." Silas's mouth opened in shock, but Ezekiel had already turned away. He didn't need Silas's words. He needed the ledger. The chamber door stood open, the torchlight inside flickering like nervous breath. Catherine followed Ezekiel into the room, and the moment she crossed the threshold, the air changed, thickening, darkening. This place had always been wrong. The walls were limestone, still cold even in the humid southern heat. Symbols were carved into the stone, circles intersecting circles, crude drawings of wheat and blood droplets, the brethren's twisted claim that their prosperity came from harvested sacrifice. Catherine's skin crawled. She remembered being dragged here as a girl, drugged so heavily her limbs barely moved, forced to watch men in robes chant while her father whispered in her ear, "See, child, this is order." This was not order. This was rot. And in the center of the room, on a pedestal carved from a cypress stump, sat the ledger. No ornament, no lock, because the brethren never believed they'd need one. Men who feel untouchable rarely prepare for consequences. Ezekiel lifted the book with both hands. It was heavier than Catherine remembered, thick with decades of crimes written in a hand too neat, too proud. The candle gutters, dust swirls, the house groans above them. As Ezekiel placed the ledger on the stone table, Catherine spoke first. "What do we do with it?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he opened the book. Pages whispered like old bones. There were entries dating back to 1802, the earliest members of the Brethren, the first families they destroyed, newly enslaved men and women taken from auctions, children listed as offerings. A section with initials instead of names, because even these men felt the weight of certain sins. Catherine read one line and felt her stomach twist. C.R. Correction applied. Mind tempered. Her father's initials. Her childhood. Ezekiel turned to the pages he knew by number. The entries from 1838. The separation of his wife Sarah and their children, Benjamin and Ruth. A single pen stroke had divided his world into ash. Catherine saw his jaw tighten, but Ezekiel did not break. His strength didn't come from rage. It came from purpose. He closed the ledger gently, as if handling a sacred object. "This book," he said quietly, "is their spine. Break it, and they fall. Burn it, and the county forgets. Expose it, and the county rises." Catherine understood at once. Destroying the ledger would destroy the truth, but keeping it intact would destroy the brethren. She whispered, "We take it to Jonah." Ezekiel nodded. That was the plan. It had always been the plan. But the plan depended on one more thing. The chamber had to be sealed. The brethren had to be contained, and no one else on the plantation could die for these men's sins. Catherine moved toward the doorway, but Ezekiel caught her wrist. "Not yet." She stopped. "Why?" He stepped back into the center of the chamber, studying the walls, the ceiling, the alignment of torches. His eyes moved not with fear, but with engineering. Ezekiel had worked in enough barns, enough smokehouses, enough drying sheds to know exactly how structures breathed and how to suffocate them. He pulled the oilcloth from his pocket, unwrapped it, and revealed the flint and tinder he had taken earlier. Catherine's breath hitched. "You're burning it now?" "No," Ezekiel said. "I'm burning them now." He meant the brethren, not the ledger, not the staff, not Catherine. Just the men who had turned Cypress Grove into a tomb for everyone else. Catherine looked back toward the hallway. The robed bodies lay helpless, gasping, twitching, trying to drag themselves away from the realization settling over them. Fire in a sealed chamber. The perfect judge. The perfect jury. The perfect punishment. Catherine's voice trembled. "If we start the fire now, we have minutes to escape." "Enough," Ezekiel said. Silas's voice echoed faintly from outside. "Catherine! Catherine! Listen to me! If you do this, you're no daughter of mine!" Catherine's heart clenched, but not out of love, out of revelation. She whispered back, not loud enough for him to hear, "I never was." Ezekiel tossed the first spark into the oil-soaked corner. Flames licked upward immediately, slow at first, but then hungrily. The chamber began to glow orange. Smoke thickened the air. Catherine took one last look at the ledger, carefully wrapped now, protected, ready to be carried north where the truth could live. Then Ezekiel took her hand. Not as captor and captive, not as master and enslaved, but as two people who had chosen the same path. "We go now," he said. Behind them, the fire crawled across the chamber, catching robes, wood, tapestries, everything the brethren had used to mask their horrors. The house creaked. The floor trembled. The trapped men screamed without volume, their bodies unable to rise. Ezekiel stepped over the bodies of the brethren without pause, None of them could move, all of them could see. That was the justice. Judge Harwood clawed weakly at the floorboards, fingernails scraping wood. Reverend Malloy's breathing came in short, panicked bursts. Merchant Ellis lay on his side, staring at the ceiling as if praying for a miracle that would never come. And Silas Ruddled, dragged his failing body an inch at a time toward Ezekiel, hate burning in his eyes even as his limbs betrayed him. "You dare," Silas rasped, "after I elevated you, after I spared your—" Ezekiel stopped. He looked down at Silas with an expression that wasn't hatred. It was clarity sharpened by grief. "You ended my family," Ezekiel said calmly. "Tonight I end the silence that kept you safe." Silas's mouth opened in shock, but Ezekiel had already turned away. He didn't need Silas's words. He needed the ledger. The chamber door stood open, the torchlight inside flickering like nervous breath. Catherine followed Ezekiel into the room, and the moment she crossed the threshold, the air changed, thickening, darkening. This place had always been wrong. The walls were limestone, still cold even in the humid southern heat. Symbols were carved into the stone, circles intersecting circles, crude drawings of wheat and blood droplets, the brethren's twisted claim that their prosperity came from harvested sacrifice. Catherine's skin crawled. She remembered being dragged here as a girl, drugged so heavily her limbs barely moved, forced to watchmen in robes chant while her father whispered in her ear, "See, child, this is order." This was not order. This was rot. And in the center of the room, on a pedestal carved from a cypress stump, sat the ledger. No ornament, no lock, because the brethren had never believed they'd need one. Men who feel untouchable rarely prepare for consequences. Ezekiel lifted the book with both hands. It was heavier than Catherine remembered, thick with decades of crimes written in a hand too neat, too proud. The moment the chamber door shut, the fire roared with a violence that seemed almost alive. Heat pressed through the wood. Smoke curled beneath the door in thick black ribbons. Behind it, the brethren, the most powerful men in the county, lay paralyzed on the stone floor. A chorus of muffled groans rose and fell, but not a single man could lift himself an inch. Catherine didn't look back. Ezekiel didn't slow down. They moved through the narrow corridor, each step echoing with urgency. Above them, the house began to cower under its own weight, cracking, popping, creaking, as if the walls finally understood what was happening. Justice. And justice burns. The smoke spread with terrifying speed. Ezekiel yanked open the servants' passage and guided Catherine through the crowling dark. Flames chased the edges of the floorboards now. Somewhere above them, glass shattered, and the distant wail of someone discovering the fire split the silence. "Down," Ezekiel ordered. They ducked low, staying beneath the smoke as they slipped into the kitchen. Panicked voices rose outside, the enslaved workers shouting warnings, grabbing buckets, rushing instinctively to fight the blaze. Catherine froze. "Ezekiel," she whispered, "they'll die trying to put it out." He turned to her sharply, not in anger, in gravity. "They won't. Not tonight." Ezekiel strode into the courtyard and shouted with all the authority the others had always been denied. "Leave it! Let the house go!" The workers stared, stunned, then recognition hit. These people had seen enough of Ezekiel's quiet strength to know he spoke truth, not panic. One by one they backed away. Buckets dropped, warnings spread. And for the first time in its existence, Cypress Grove burned without a single black hand forced to save it. Catherine stood at the back door, watching the flames devour the plantation that had been her prison. The windows blew out. The porch beams collapsed, and the night sky glowed orange, lighting the marsh like a sunrise made of fire. Silas Rutland was still inside. So were the 12 men who had believed themselves untouchable. No one moved to rescue them. No one even tried. Catherine clutched the wrapped ledger to her chest. "It's over," she said. Ezekiel shook his head. "No, it begins now." They didn't run at first. Running drew attention. Attention drew questions. Instead, they moved like shadows behind the burning house, using the chaos as cover. The enslaved quarters were alive with whispers, fear, hope, confusion, but no one stopped them. Ezekiel led Catherine toward the old road behind the cypress mill, a road used only for hauling lumber and rarely patrolled. As they disappeared into the trees, the entire horizon behind them was painted in flames. Catherine stumbled once, breath shaking. Ezekiel steadied her. "You saved yourself," he said. "What happens next is saving others." They traveled through the night, avoiding the main roads. Catherine's shoes tore. Ezekiel's shirt burned at the sleeve. The ledger never left her grip. By dawn they reached the river's crossing ferry. The ferryman, a quiet man with eyes that missed nothing, looked at Ezekiel, then at Catherine, and then at the smoke still rising miles behind them. He didn't ask questions. He simply nodded. The ferry pulled away from the bank, cutting silently across the water. Cypress Grove's final embers flickered faintly in the distance, drifting upward like the last lies finally releasing their hold. Catherine leaned her head on her knees. Exhaustion swept through her. "What do we tell Jonah?" she murmured. "The truth," Ezekiel said. "All of it?" "All of it." Jonah was waiting at Dawson's Ferry. A tall, broad-shouldered freedman preacher with a calm presence that settled the air around him. His church was small, bare wood, a dirt path, no steeple, but it felt more like sanctuary than Cypress Grove ever had. Jonah took one look at Ezekiel and embraced him hard. "You're late," he said, voice trembling with relief. Ezekiel managed a faint smile. "Had a fire to tend." Jonah turned to Catherine. "Are you willing? Sharing truth comes with a price." Catherine lifted the ledger. "I'm done living in silence." Jonah opened the book on the small wooden table, candlelight flickering across the inked pages. His hands shook as he read line after line. Transactions, rituals, separations, punishments. When he reached the entries about Ezekiel's family, Jonah stopped, eyes tightening. "This," he said, quietly, "will break the county open." "Good," Ezekiel answered. Jonah straightened. "We gather the free papers, the safe house writers, the northern journalists, we copy every page, we deliver it to every courthouse and newspaper from Charleston to Richmond." Catherine swallowed. "What happens then?" Jonah looked at her with a gravity that softened his voice. Jonah shook foundations. Some crumble, some rebuild, but lies burn." She understood. The ledger had already killed men. Now it would bury their legacy. 3 months later, everyone in South Carolina knew the story. Not the false story Silas's surviving cousins tried to paint, not the polite version whispered at church gatherings, but the real one. The ledger leaked page by page. Names were printed, trials began, families reclaimed, rituals exposed, property seized, Reverend Mallory's church closed, Judge Harwood fled the state, Merchant Ellis was arrested on the docks. Cypress Grove was marked permanently as a site of atrocity, and the Brethren of the Harvest became a curse whispered only to scare children. As for Catherine, she never returned to the South. She lived under a new name in the North, working quietly with abolitionists, teaching women who had been silenced how to speak again. As for Ezekiel, he became the most wanted man in South Carolina, but the county could never find him, because people protect the ones who told them the truth. Some said he moved north, some said he joined the underground networks, some said he headed west. But one story, passed down in whispers, claimed he returned to the ashes of Cypress Grove one last time. Not to mourn, not to hide, to stand in the place where the powerful had fallen and say the words he had waited so long to speak. "You didn't break me." No stone marked the graves of the brethren. No monument honored them. Cypress Grove became vines and swamp and silence again. But the ledger survived, because truth, once freed, does not burn, and neither did the memory of the man who lit the match.